The town of Bitter Creek laughed when the wealthiest rancher in the territory accepted a bride as a cruel joke to settle a heavy debt. They called her the heavy-set spinster, the ugly Miller girl. But those laughing fools had no idea she was exactly what he'd been hunting for. The Colorado Territory in 1881 was a place that forgave very little, and it certainly did not forgive weakness. It was a land of sprawling, unforgiving plains, brutal winters, and a sun that baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. In the dusty, ramshackle town of Bitter Creek, survival was the only currency that truly mattered. Yet, society still clung to its shallow judgments, and no one bore the brunt of those judgments quite like Josephine Miller. Josie was a large woman. In an era that prized delicate, wasp-waisted femininity and fragile sensibilities, she stood out like a boulder in a stream of pebbles. She was heavy-set, with a thick waist, broad shoulders, and arms built from years of hauling feed, chopping wood, and wrestling calves into the branding chutes. Her face was round and pleasant, marked by intelligent, watchful brown eyes. But the townsfolk rarely looked past her formidable size. Behind her back and often right to her face, she was the butt of 100 cruel jokes. They called her the Miller Draft Horse, a spinster at 24, destined to die alone, buried under the weight of her own family's failing fortunes. Her father, Amos Miller, was a man whose ambition was vastly outweighed by his incompetence. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and let his cattle starve while he chased phantom gold strikes in the mountains. The only reason the Miller Ranch hadn't been foreclosed on years ago was Josie. While her younger sister, Lillian, a petite, conventionally beautiful 19-year-old with a heart as shallow as a puddle, spent her days ordering silk ribbons from the Montgomery Ward catalog. Josie ran the ranch. She balanced the ledgers, stretched the meager rations, and worked the fields until her hands were rough as sandpaper. But Josie's sheer willpower couldn't outpace her father's gambling debts. By the autumn of '81, Amos Miller was in the hole for $3,000 to Wyatt Hayes. Wyatt was everything Amos was not. At 34, Wyatt owned the Red Ridge Ranch, an empire of beef and timber that stretched across the valley. He was a stoic, imposing figure, hardened by the frontier. He didn't speak often, but when he did, men listened. He was ruthless in business, but fair to his hands, a solitary man who had spent his life building a kingdom with no queen to share it. The confrontation happened in the smoky, whiskey-soaked confines of the Red Dog Saloon. Amos, cornered and desperate, was sweating through his collar as Wyatt slid the promissory note across the scarred wooden table. "Time's up, Amos," Wyatt said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I want my money, or I'm taking the deed to your lower pastures and the water rights to the creek." Amos grew pale. Losing the water rights meant losing the ranch entirely. He laughed nervously, looking around the room at the other ranchers, hoping to save face. "Now, Wyatt, be reasonable. The herd was thin this year. Give me till spring." No. Desperation makes fools of men. And Amos Miller was already halfway there. In a pathetic attempt to deflect the tension, Amos leaned back and chuckled, a nasty, desperate sound. "Well, if you want property, Hayes, I ain't got the cash. But I'll make you a trade. You wipe the debt, and I'll give you my oldest girl, Josie. Lord knows she ain't getting any lighter, and I ain't getting any richer. She can eat her weight in flapjacks, but she'll keep you warm in the winter. Take the ugly one, and we call the debt square." The saloon erupted into nervous, cruel laughter. Men slapped their knees, imagining the notoriously solitary, wealthy Wyatt Hayes saddled with the obese, plain-faced Miller girl. It was the ultimate insult, a joke meant to force Wyatt into disgust so he might grant an extension just to get away from the conversation. Wyatt didn't laugh. He sat perfectly still, his cold blue eyes locked onto Amos's sweating face. Wyatt knew Josephine Miller. He had watched her for 2 years. He had seen her at the Mercantile, negotiating the price of grain with a sharp, mathematical mind that left the store owner dizzy. He had seen her in the mud during the spring thaw, single-handedly pulling a trapped foal from a bog while two grown men stood by uselessly. He had seen the way she carried herself, not with the shrinking, apologetic posture of a victim, but with the quiet, immovable dignity of a mountain. Wyatt despised fragile things. He despised the simpering town women who fainted at the sight of blood and complained about the dust. He had been looking for a partner, someone with enough grit and intelligence to stand beside him and run an empire. The saloon quieted down as Wyatt's silence stretched on. He slowly reached out, took the promissory note, and struck a match. The men watched in stunned silence as the paper caught fire, the flames licking away the $3,000 debt. Wyatt dropped the burning paper into an empty whiskey glass. "Deal," Wyatt said, his voice cutting through the silence like a gunshot. "Have her packed and at the courthouse by noon tomorrow. And Amos, if she isn't there, I won't just take your water rights. I'll take every inch of dirt you claim to own." Amos's jaw dropped. The joke had backfired spectacularly. He had just traded away his only competent worker. Back at the Miller Ranch, the news was delivered not with an apology, but with a defensive roar. Amos burst into the kitchen, smelling of stale liquor and panic, and told Josie to pack her things. Lillian sat by the hearth, her delicate hands covering her mouth to stifle her giggles. "Sold like a prized hog, Josie," Lillian sneered, "though I suppose Mr. Hayes is paying by the pound." Josie didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a waste of moisture in a dry country. She simply stood at the heavy wooden table, her flour-dusted hands gripping the edges until her knuckles turned white. She felt a deep, burning humiliation in her chest. A joke. She was being married off as a cruel tavern joke to settle her father's gambling debt. She knew what the town thought of her size. She knew she wasn't a porcelain doll, but she was a human being. "You'll ruin this ranch without me, Pa," Josie said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Shut your mouth and pack," Amos snapped, unable to meet her eyes because he knew she was right. That night, Josie packed her single trunk. She folded her practical dark cotton dresses, her heavy wool shawls, and her mother's old iron skillet. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above her washstand. She saw her thick neck, the heavy curves of her body, the plainness of her features. She braced herself for a life of being ignored, or worse, mocked by a husband who had only taken her to prove a point. But as she closed the trunk, a spark of defiance lit in her brown eyes. Wyatt Hayes might have taken her as a joke, but Josephine Miller was nobody's fool. The wedding at the Bitter Creek Courthouse was a grim, 10-minute affair. There were no flowers, no music, and no well-wishers, save for the justice of the peace, who looked thoroughly confused. Josie wore her best dress, a heavy, dark green wool that did nothing to hide the vast expanse of her figure. She stood rigidly, staring straight ahead, refusing to let the town gossips peering through the courthouse windows see her sweat. Beside her stood Wyatt Hayes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in a dark suit that smelled faintly of cedar and leather. He said his vows in a clear, unwavering voice. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, Wyatt didn't lean in for a kiss. He simply tipped his hat to the magistrate, picked up Josie's heavy trunk with one hand as if it weighed nothing, and said, "Let's go, Mrs. Hayes." Josie followed him out to the street, where a sturdy buckboard wagon pulled by two massive black draft horses waited. The ride to the Red Ridge Ranch was 15 miles of rough, uphill terrain. For the first 5 miles, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, oppressive, and heavy with unspoken assumptions. Josie sat stiffly on the wooden bench, acutely aware of the space she took up. Her hip brushed against Wyatt's thigh every time the wagon hit a rut, and she instinctively tried to make herself smaller, a nearly impossible task. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating tension, she spoke, her voice laced with defensive steel. "I know why you did this, Mr. Hayes," she said. looking out at the rolling plains rather than at him. Wyatt kept his eyes on the horses. "Do you? My father is a fool, and he backed you into a corner in front of the town. You took me to call his bluff." Josie gripped her hands together in her lap. "I want you to know that I understand the arrangement. I'll earn my keep. I can cook for a crew of 50, I can manage a ledger better than any man in the territory, and I know cattle. You won't have to treat me like a wife, and you certainly won't have to look at me any more than is strictly necessary. I won't be a burden." Wyatt pulled back on the reins, bringing the heavy wagon to a sudden halt in the middle of the empty prairie. The dust swirled up around them. He turned on the bench to face her fully. His intense, ice-blue eyes scanned her face, stripping away the defensive armor she wore so tightly. "Josephine," he said, his tone surprisingly soft but commanding. "If I wanted a cook, I would have hired one. If I wanted an accountant, I'd send to Denver. I took you because I've watched you carry a failing ranch on your back for 2 years while your father drank it away. I didn't marry you as a joke. I married you because I need a partner who won't break when the wind blows." Josie stared at him, stunned. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Nobody had ever looked at her without a trace of pity or mockery. But "my size," she stammered, the vulnerability slipping out before she could stop it. "Your size means you're built for the frontier, not a parlor room," Wyatt interrupted smoothly. "You're strong. I respect strength. Now, unless you have further objections to being my wife, we have 10 miles left before dark." He clicked his tongue, and the horses lurched forward. Josie sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. For the rest of the journey, she didn't try to shrink herself away from him. They arrived at the Red Ridge Ranch just as the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The ranch was magnificent, sprawling barns, massive corrals, and a 3-story timber house that loomed over the valley. But as Wyatt helped her down from the wagon, Josie immediately noticed the neglect in the domestic sphere. The porch was covered in dirt, the windows were grimy, and the front yard was littered with discarded horseshoes and empty tins. The ranch was run by men, and it showed. A grizzled foreman named Hollis trotted up, touching the brim of his hat. "Boss, you're back late!" Hollis's eyes darted to Josie, widening slightly in surprise. He had obviously heard the rumors of the saloon bet, but seeing the immense woman standing beside his boss made the reality set in. "Hollis, this is my wife, Mrs. Hayes," Wyatt said firmly. "She is the mistress of Red Ridge. Her word is my word." Hollis swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Welcome, ma'am." As Wyatt led her toward the house, a group of ranch hands gathered near the bunkhouse, whispering and elbowing each other. Josie's sharp ears caught the tail end of a comment from a young, arrogant-looking cowboy named Garrett. "Reckon the boss bought himself a draft horse instead of a filly. Wonder if she needs a custom saddle." Laughter erupted from a few of the men. Josie froze. The familiar sting of humiliation flooded her cheeks. She instinctively looked at Wyatt, expecting him to either ignore it or join in, as her father would have. Wyatt's jaw tightened, his hand dropping toward the colt, strapped to his hip. He took a heavy step toward the bunkhouse, murder in his eyes. "Wyatt, wait," Josie said, her voice sharp. She reached out, her thick, strong fingers wrapping around his forearm. She looked up at him. "Let me." Wyatt paused, his eyes searching hers. Slowly, he nodded and stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest to watch. Josie turned and walked toward the bunkhouse. She didn't hurry. She walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of a woman who knew her own power. The laughter died in the cowboys' throats as she approached. Up close, Josie was an imposing figure, nearly as tall as some of the men and twice as wide. She stopped directly in front of Garrett, who suddenly looked very young and very nervous. "You're Garrett, I presume?" Josie asked, her voice carrying across the quiet yard. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered, looking at his boots. "Look at me when I speak to you," she commanded, the tone snapping like a bullwhip. Garrett's head jerked up. If you have an issue with my size, you can take it up with me directly, Josie said, her voice dangerously calm. But know this. I can haul a 50-pound sack of grain on each shoulder, I can balance the books that pay your wages, and I know exactly how much coffee and bacon a crew this size goes through in a week. If I hear one more whisper about draft horses, you won't be eating from the chuck wagon. You'll be eating whatever you can scrounge from the dirt, because I control the larder. Do we understand each other? Garrett swallowed hard, pale beneath his sunburn. Yes, ma'am. I apologize, ma'am. Good. Now get a broom and sweep my front porch. It looks like a pigsty. Josie turned on her heel and walked back to Wyatt, not looking back. Wyatt's eyes were practically glowing with amusement and deep, undeniable respect. As she reached him, a rare, genuine smile broke across his rugged face. "Draft horse my eye," Wyatt murmured as he opened the front door for her. "You're a damned force of nature, Josephine." For the first time in her life, Josie stepped over a threshold, not as a beast of burden and not as a joke. She stepped into Red Ridge Ranch as its queen, and she intended to rule. The first 6 months at Red Ridge Ranch brought changes that the territory of Colorado would talk about for decades. Josephine Hayes did not simply clean the house, she fundamentally restructured the entire enterprise. Under her heavy, capable hands, the sprawling empire transformed from a chaotic bachelor's camp into a ruthlessly efficient, wildly profitable kingdom. She fired the lazy hands, doubled the rations for the hard workers, and completely overhauled the ledgers. Even young Garrett, who had once mocked her, now followed her orders with a fierce, unwavering loyalty, recognizing a true leader when he saw one. Wyatt watched his wife with growing fascination. He had married her for her grit, but he had not anticipated the sheer brilliance of her mind. They spent their evenings in the main study, seated across from each other by the roaring hearth. While other husbands might have demanded soft words and subservience, Wyatt demanded Josie's opinions on beef prices, grazing routes, and the incoming railroad lines. But prosperity always breeds envy, and betrayal often festers close to home. By late November of 1881, the temperatures plummeted, heralding what would become one of the most brutal winters in recorded Western history. As Josie pored over the autumn shipping manifests, comparing them against the rates set by the Philip Danforth Armour meatpacking empire in Chicago, a chilling discrepancy emerged. The numbers did not align. According to the stockyard receipts, Red Ridge had shipped 3,000 head of cattle. But Josie's meticulous field counts proved they had rounded up nearly 3,500. 500 prime steers had vanished into thin air. Josie did not immediately alert Wyatt. She knew her husband's temper. If Wyatt suspected theft, he would ride out with his Winchester and start shooting, which could ignite a range war. Instead, Josie discreetly sent a wire to Denver, hiring a man named John from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Posing as a traveling saddle maker, the agent spent a week at Red Ridge, listening to the murmurs in the bunkhouse and tracking hoofprints in the lower canyons. The truth, when it arrived in a sealed envelope, was a jagged knife to Josie's chest. The rustling ring was not being run by rival cattle barons or roaming outlaws. It was an inside job, orchestrated by Hollis, their trusted foreman. And his primary partner in the black market sales was none other than Amos Miller, Josie's own father. Amos had used his knowledge of Red Ridge's blind spots, combined with Hollis's ability to manipulate the night guard schedules, to siphon off the herd and sell them across the border. Amos had assumed that because Josie was a woman, and in his eyes, a slow, heavy-set fool, she would never notice the missing cattle in the vast ledgers. The revelation shattered any lingering shred of familial duty Josie harbored. Her father had not only sold her like livestock, he was now attempting to bankrupt the man who had taken her in. The climax of the betrayal aligned perfectly with Wyatt's absence. In early December, Wyatt rode south to negotiate a massive land lease with the legendary cattleman Charles Goodnight, leaving Josie in absolute command of the ranch. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple, and the barometric pressure dropped sharply. A historic blizzard was brewing. Josie stood on the porch, feeling the icy wind bite through her heavy wool shawl. She watched Hollis saddle his horse, barking orders at a small crew of his hand-picked loyalists. They were preparing to move the stragglers to the winter pastures in the eastern canyon, a perfect cover for driving another stolen herd right into Amos Miller's waiting hands before the snow locked the passes. Josie turned back inside, her broad face set in stone. She marched into the study, unlocked the heavy oak gun cabinet, and pulled out a lever-action Winchester rifle. She checked the chamber with practiced, fluid movements. She was not a delicate flower waiting to be saved. She was the mistress of Red Ridge. The Eastern Canyon was a treacherous bottleneck of red rock and scrub oak. By the time Hollis and his men drove the 200 stolen steers into the gorge, the snow was falling in blinding horizontal sheets. Waiting at the mouth of the canyon, huddled near a small, sputtering fire, was Amos Miller. "About time, Hollis!" Amos shouted over the howling wind, his face red from cheap whiskey and cold. "Let's get these beasts moving before the snow traps us. That fat cow of a daughter of mine won't even realize they're gone until spring." "I wouldn't bet your life on that, Pa." The voice boomed through the canyon, cutting through the roaring blizzard like a thunderclap. Amos and Hollis whipped around. Emerging from the swirling whiteout was a massive, terrifying silhouette. Josie rode a hulking black Shire draft horse, the only beast strong enough to carry her easily through the deep snow. She sat tall in the saddle, wearing a thick buffalo coat, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Flanking her were Garrett and a dozen of the most loyal, heavily armed Red Ridge cowboys. Amos stumbled backward, his whiskey flask dropping into the snow. Hollis swore viciously, his hand dropping instinctively toward the revolver at his hip. "Don't do it, Hollis," Josie warned, her voice radiating absolute lethal authority. She leveled the Winchester directly at the foreman's chest. "I've balanced your books, and I've weighed your worth. You're coming up short. Move your hand away from that iron, or I'll leave you for the wolves." Hollis hesitated, sizing up the heavy-set woman he had mocked behind her back for months. He saw the unflinching steadiness in her brown eyes and the unwavering barrel of the rifle. Slowly, bitterly, he raised his hands. "Disarm them," Josie ordered. Garrett and the loyal hands rode forward, stripping Hollis and the rustlers of their weapons and binding their wrists. Josie nudged her massive horse forward until she was towering over her trembling father. Amos looked up at her, terrified. He didn't see the ugly, burdensome spinster he had joked about in the saloon. He saw a queen forged in iron and ice. "Josie, please," Amos whimpered, falling to his knees in the snow. "I'm your blood. I'm your father. It was just a little mistake, a misunderstanding. You made your trade at the Red Dog Saloon, Amos," Josie said coldly, her words falling like stones. "You traded me to settle your debts. That means I owe you nothing. You will ride out of this valley today, and if I ever see your face on Red Ridge land again, I won't bother with the sheriff. I'll bury you myself." When Wyatt Hayes returned 2 days later, he found the blizzard had broken, leaving the ranch blanketed in pristine, glittering white. But the tranquility was deceptive. He rode into the yard to find Hollis and 5 men chained to the corral fence, waiting for the federal marshals, while the full herd grazed safely in the heavily guarded home pastures. Wyatt burst into the main house, his heart pounding with a strange, unfamiliar terror. He found Josie in the kitchen, casually kneading bread dough, her thick arms covered in flour, completely unharmed. Garrett had already intercepted Wyatt by the stables, breathlessly recounting the tale of the canyon, how the boss's wife had stared down armed rustlers in a blinding snowstorm, captured her own father, and saved the entire winter profits without shedding a drop of blood. Wyatt stopped in the doorway, staring at her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, but this time there was no hostility in it. There was only a profound, overwhelming awe. He walked slowly across the kitchen floor. He didn't care about the flour or the dirt on his boots. He reached out, his rough, scarred hands gently taking her flour-dusted face. For the first time since their grim wedding day, Wyatt looked deep into her eyes, and Josie saw exactly what she had always yearned for. Not pity, not a business arrangement. Pure, unadulterated adoration. "I bought a rancher's daughter to spite a fool," Wyatt whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But God Almighty, Josephine, I brought home a legend." He kissed her then, a fierce, claiming kiss that tasted of the cold winter wind and undeniable passion. Josie did not shrink away. She wrapped her strong arms around his neck, finally stepping fully into the space she was meant to occupy. The town of Bitter Creek never laughed at Josephine Hayes again. Over the next 40 years, Wyatt and Josie built the greatest cattle dynasty in the Colorado Territory. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a formidable, unbreakable force. The history books would remember Wyatt as a great pioneer, but the men who rode the ranges knew the truth. The real power behind the empire was the heavy-set, brilliant woman who took a cruel joke and turned it into an undeniable, magnificent destiny. Did Josie's incredible journey from a mocked outcast to the unstoppable queen of the Wild West leave you breathless? Her story proves that true strength and worth are never defined by a narrow mirror, but by an iron will and a courageous heart. If you love this dramatic tale of frontier justice, romance, and ultimate redemption, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life historical stories right now.